She came to the canyon with a knife and a lie. That was how it started. Not with gunfire, not with the thunder of railroad men pushing west across land that had never asked for them. It started quietly, the way most dangerous things do, a woman riding alone into the high country, her horse picking careful steps along a trail that barely deserved the name, a folded envelope in her saddlebag containing more money than she had seen in 3 years of work combined. The knife was her own. The lie belonged to someone else. She had simply agreed to carry it. Her name was Saya. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a White Mountain Apache woman and a man who had come through the territory selling dry goods and left before the first snow. She had her mother's eyes and her father's ability to disappear when the situation required it. She spoke 4 languages: Apache, Spanish, English, and a rough working knowledge of the particular dialect of silence that men in power used when they wanted something done without being seen to want it. She had grown up on the edges of 3 different worlds and belonged fully to none of them, which made her useful to people who needed someone to move between. The man who had hired her was named Aldous Crane. He ran the Southwestern Pacific Railroad's Land Acquisition Division, which was a clean name for a dirty business. He wore a gray suit that cost more than most men in the territory earned in a month, kept his boots polished to a mirror shine regardless of the dust, and had the kind of smile that reached his eyes only when he was calculating something. He had found Saya through a network of intermediaries, a scout who knew a trader who knew a man who had once seen her talk a group of armed Yavapai down from a ridge with nothing but her voice and a steady posture. Crane collected useful people the way other men collected land grants. He filed them away and pulled them out when the occasion demanded. The occasion, in this case, was a man named Coldray. Crane had explained it over a map spread across a mahogany desk in a Tucson office that smelled of cedar and cigar smoke. Coldray, he said, was an outlaw, a former Army scout turned fugitive, wanted in 3 territories for robbery, destruction of railroad property, and the murder of 2 Southwestern Pacific surveyors. Though that last charge, Crane admitted without meeting her eyes, was complicated. Dre had been operating out of the canyon country north of the Gila for the better part of 2 years. He knew the land the way a man knows his own heartbeat. Every marshal who had gone in after him had come back empty-handed or not come back at all. Crane needed someone who could get close. Someone Dre would not immediately read as a threat. Someone who knew the canyon country. Someone who looked like she belonged there. Saya had listened to all of this without expression. Then she had looked at the money on the desk. Not a small amount. Not an amount you turned down when your mother's roof needed new timber and the winter was coming. And she had picked it up and put it in her coat pocket and said she would see what she could do. She had not asked what would happen to Dre once she found him. She told herself that was because she already knew. She told herself a lot of things on that first ride north. The canyon country received her the way it always did, without ceremony, without warmth, without any particular acknowledgement that she had arrived. The walls of red sandstone rose on either side of the trail, striated in bands of rust and ochre and a deep bruised purple that only showed at dusk. Juniper and pinyon clung to the ledges. A hawk turned slow circles overhead, riding a thermal with the total indifference of a creature that had never needed to justify its presence anywhere. The air smelled of dust and sage and the particular mineral cold that came off the rock faces in the late afternoon. She had grown up not far from country like this. It remembered her the way land remembers, through the body, through the feet, through something below language. She made camp the first night in a shallow overhang she had used before, years ago, on a different errand for different people. Built a small fire, ate dried meat and cornbread she had packed in Tucson, and sat watching the flames die down while she thought about what she was doing and whether the money was worth it, and whether she had ever in her life done something purely because it was right rather than because it was necessary. She fell asleep before she arrived at an answer. She had been given a description of Dre. 32 years old, roughly 6 feet, dark hair going gray at the temples, a scar along his left jaw from a knife fight in Yuma that he had technically won. Former 5th Cavalry, served 6 years before his discharge under circumstances that Crane had described as dishonorable and that Saya suspected were more complicated than that. He was, according to Crane's sources, occasionally seen trading at a small outpost settlement called Redwall, which sat at the confluence of two canyon tributaries about 2 days' ride from where she had camped. He was known to be cautious. He was known to be armed. He was known to be, in the words of one marshal's report she had been shown, not a man you surprised in a small space. She had filed all of that away and was now in the process of deciding how much of it was useful and how much of it was the particular story powerful men told about the people who refused to be useful to them. She reached Redwall on the afternoon of the second day and tied her horse at the rail outside the trading post and went inside and bought flour and salt and a small tin of tobacco she did not particularly need. The man behind the counter was named Gus, ancient and leather-faced, who had been in the canyon country since before the war and had strong opinions about the railroad that he shared whether or not you asked. She let him talk. She bought a second tin of tobacco. She asked, carefully and with apparent disinterest, whether there was good water up the North Fork, because she had heard the springs there were reliable in the dry season. Gus looked at her for a moment. Then he said the springs were fine. He said the North Fork was quiet country. He said a person could camp up there for weeks without seeing another soul, if that was what they were looking for. She thanked him and left. She found the first sign of coal dray on the morning of the fourth day. It was not a footprint or a cold campfire or any of the obvious markers she had been half expecting. It was a snare set low in the brush along the creek bed, the kind of trap a man makes when he knows the land well enough to know exactly where the rabbits run. Expertly made. Recent. She crouched beside it for a long time, studying the construction, the particular way the cord was knotted, the angle of the trigger stick, and then she stood up and walked away without touching it and made her own camp a quarter-mile downstream and waited. He found her before she found him. That should not have surprised her, but it did. She was at her fire on the second evening. Cooking the rabbit, she had caught herself with a method her mother had taught her, when she became aware that she was not alone. Not from sound. He made almost none, but from the particular quality of attention that the air takes on when someone nearby is watching with focus. She did not reach for her rifle. She turned the rabbit on the spit and said, without looking up, that there was enough for two if he had not eaten. A long silence. Then the sound of boots on dry ground, and cold dray walked into the firelight. He was more or less as described, which was to say he was not what she had expected. The scar was there, following the line of his jaw in a way that had healed clean and old. The gray at his temples was more pronounced than the description suggested. He was lean in the way men get who have been living hard and moving often, not the leanness of deprivation, but of constant use, every part of him worn down to what was necessary. He stood at the edge of the firelight and looked at her with the particular expression of a man doing rapid and careful calculations, and she looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman who was doing the same and was not going to let him see it. He sat down across the fire. She handed him half the rabbit. He ate without speaking for a while, and she let the silence sit there between them like a third person at the meal, comfortable and undemanding. After a time, he said, "You know this country?" She said she had been through it before. He said, "Not many people come up the North Fork for no reason." She said she had reasons. He looked at her. She looked at the fire. The hawk that had been following her since the first day, or one very like it, turned a single slow circle above the canyon rim, black against a sky going the color of a bruise, and then was gone. He did not ask what the reasons were. That was the first thing about him that she filed away separately from what Crane had told her. A man who does not push. A man who waits. She told him her name. He told her his, and she watched his face while he did it. Watched for the particular performance of a man using a false name, and saw none. Cold dray, he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to be cold dray in the canyon country with warrants on him in 3 territories. She said it was a good night for a fire. He said it was. That was the first evening. She would think about it later, about how ordinary it was, how the whole impossible thing that followed had its roots in something as simple as shared food and a fire, and 2 people choosing, for whatever private reasons, not to be the thing the other person expected. She stayed in the canyon country. That had been the plan. Establish a presence, build trust, give Dre a reason to let his guard down. She had a cover story about trading, about needing to winter in the high country, about a dispute in Tucson that made the city uncomfortable for now. All of it plausible, none of it true. She had told variations of that story before, to men who had less reason to be careful than Cole Dre, and it had worked. She was good at the particular performance of ordinariness. She had been doing it her whole life in one form or another, performing legibility for whoever needed her to be legible, adjusting the story to fit the audience. What she had not accounted for was that Dre was not particularly interested in her story. He was interested in her, not in the way she had been prepared for, not with the particular attention of a man who wants something from a woman, but with the quiet, unhurried curiosity of someone who finds another person genuinely interesting and has no agenda about what to do with that interest. He asked about the country she had grown up in. He asked about her mother, after she mentioned her once in passing, and listened to the answer without offering anything comparative or sympathetic. Just listen the way you listen when you are actually absorbing what someone says. He knew the canyon country with the same depth she knew it, differently from different angles, but with the same quality of attention, the same refusal to be merely passing through. They fell into a loose routine over the first 2 weeks. She had her camp. He had his. She never saw it. He never offered to show her. But he came by most evenings, and sometimes in the morning she would find a rabbit already cleaned and left near a fire ring, and once a clay pot of honey from a hive he had found in a rock crevice, the pot sealed with a piece of cloth and left without explanation or note. She sent her first message to Crane's man at Redwall on the 12th day. She said she had made contact. She said progress was slow. She said she needed more time. All of that was true. She did not say that she had started to dread the moment when there would be nothing more to report. The canyon country in late autumn was a particular kind of beauty, not soft, not welcoming, not the kind that invited you to relax into it. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and were beginning to let go, the leaves coming down in slow spirals and collecting in the eddies of the water. The cold came down off the rim at night with a clean authority. The stars in the high desert were not like stars anywhere else, not a backdrop, but a presence. The Milky Way so dense and bright it cast a faint shadow. She had grown up with those stars and had spent years in towns and cities where you could not see them, and being back under them did something to her that she did not have a word for in any of her 4 languages. She found herself talking to Dre about things she did not normally talk about. Not the important things, not Crane, not the money, not what she was doing there, but the other things, the things that had accumulated over years of being useful to people who did not particularly see her. Her mother's hands, how they had looked when she was old. The particular sound of the language she had grown up hearing and no longer heard anywhere. The way she felt in cities, not unwelcome exactly, but unreal, like a figure in someone else's story. He listened. He did not offer solutions or consolations. He said, once, that he understood the feeling of being real only in certain places. She had asked him where he was real. He had looked at the canyon walls for a moment. Then he had said, here, mostly. It was not a romantic thing, the way he said it. It was just a fact, stated plainly, the way a man states a fact about the weather. But she had turned it over in her mind for days afterward, the simplicity of it, the absolute absence of performance. She started carving his name on trees. She could not have explained it if she had tried. It was not a decision she made in any conscious sense. It was more like something her hands did while her mind was occupied elsewhere, the way you find yourself humming a song you did not choose. The first time, she was sitting against a cottonwood near the creek, waiting for the light to change, and she had her knife out to clean her nails, and then the knife was against the bark and she was pressing his name into the pale wood. C-O-L. Just those 4 letters, shallow and clean, the bark curling away in thin strips. She looked at it for a long time. She did not carve it over. She did not try to smooth it away. She got up and walked back to her camp and did not think about it directly for the rest of the day, the way you do not look directly at something that has already told you more than you wanted to know. But she did it again. The next day, a different tree, a juniper this time, the bark rough under the blade. And the day after that, and the day after that, always his name. Always somewhere along the creek or the trail between her camp and the canyon walls. Always at a height where you would see it if you were looking, but might miss it if you were not. She told herself it was a trail marker. She told herself it was habit. She told herself a great many things. The truth was simpler and harder than any of them. The truth was that she was making a record of something she did not know how to keep any other way. She was marking the place where she was real. Crane's man at Redwall was a thin, watchful person named Kit who smelled of tobacco and had the eyes of someone who had been paid to notice things for so long that he had forgotten how to stop. She met him twice a month at the trading post, always in the guise of resupply runs, always brief, always conducted in the particular code of understatement that Crane's organization favored. She told him that Dre was in the North Fork country. She told him that he moved camp regularly and was careful. She told him she was working on it. Kit wrote things down in a small notebook with a stub of pencil and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who suspects he is not being told everything. She was not telling him everything. What she was not telling him was the shape of the evenings by the fire. What she was not telling him was the honey in the clay pot. What she was not telling him was the way Dre had looked at her one morning when she had been reading aloud from a book she had packed. One of only two she had brought, a battered collection of Spanish poetry she had carried for years, and she had looked up midline to find him watching her with an expression she had no name for, an expression that was not desire exactly, or not only desire, but something that included attention and recognition and a quality of stillness that she had never seen on a man's face before. She was not telling Kit any of that. She was telling herself it didn't matter. The first snow came in November, light and early, gone by mid-morning, but leaving the canyon walls streaked white in the crevices and the creek edged with thin ice. Dre came to her camp that evening with dry wood he had split himself. She had wood. She did not need it, but she did not say so, and they built the fire up and sat close to it, and she read to him from the Spanish poetry, translating as she went, and he listened with his arms around his knees and his eyes on the fire. And when she reached a particular poem, something about a man who carries a river inside him wherever he goes, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What's the word for that?" In Apache. She thought about it. She said there was not a single word, but there was a phrase that meant something like the water that moves through you that is not your own. He said that was better than the Spanish. She said most things were. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile. She had not seen a full smile from him yet. She was not sure she ever would, but it was the movement toward one, the muscles of his face doing something that was not quite habitual. She looked back at the book before he could see what was on her face. She sent Kit a message in December that said she was close. That was not a lie exactly. She was close to something. She was just no longer certain it was what Crane had paid her to be close to. She had by this point carved his name on 11 trees. The path they made, if you had known to look for them, if you had known what you were reading, ran from her first camp on the North Fork downstream to the confluence, then up the west tributary to the place where the canyon widened into a small, sheltered valley that she had started to think of as the center of things, the place where the light came in longest and the wind dropped and the sound of the creek was loudest. 11 trees, 11 marks, a trail that went nowhere in particular and everywhere that mattered. She had not decided yet what the marks were for. She told herself that too. Cole Dre was not a simple man, but he was not a complicated one either. He was a man who had done things he could not undo and had made a particular peace with that fact. Not a comfortable peace, not the peace of a man who had decided his actions were justified, but the harder peace of a man who had looked at what he was and decided to be it honestly. She learned this about him gradually, the way you learn the topography of a place you are walking through slowly, not all at once, but in accumulation, each new detail adjusting the picture slightly. He had been a good soldier, she thought, in a way that the best soldiers are good, not because they love the work, but because they are constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway. He had scouted for the 5th Cavalry for 6 years along the Arizona-New Mexico border, which meant he had spent 6 years in the same canyon country she knew, learning it from the inside. He had also spent 6 years watching what the Army was doing to the land and the people on it, and somewhere in that 6th year something had shifted in him, some internal calculation had come up wrong, and he had made a choice. The 2 surveyors Crane had accused him of murdering had been staking claims on a stretch of canyon country that included 3 Apache water sources and a burial site that the Army had been told about and had agreed, in writing, to leave alone. Dre had been the one who told them about it. He had been the one who negotiated the agreement. When the surveyors showed up anyway, with their instruments and their stakes, and their complete indifference to what they were walking over, Dre had tried to stop them by other means first. The destruction of railroad property charge was accurate. The murder charge was not. The surveyors had been alive when he left them, furious and unhorsed and thoroughly humiliated, but alive. She found this out not from him directly. He did not tell her in any single conversation, but from the accumulated weight of small things he said, the particular places he went quiet, the way he talked about the land and what was happening to it. She was good at reading what was not said. She had been doing it her whole life. She had also, by this point, stopped pretending to herself that she was going to give Crane what he had paid for. The money was still real. Her mother's roof was still real. The winter was still real. All of that was true, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But there was another truth sitting beside it now, heavy and clear and impossible to look away from. And it was this. Cole Dre was not a man who needed to be forgotten. He was a man who had refused to forget. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than any amount of money in a folded envelope. She was sitting with this knowledge one evening in late December when Dre came to her camp earlier than usual, moving fast, and she could see from the way he was moving that something had changed. He said, "There's been someone at Redwall asking about me." She kept her face still. She said, "What kind of someone?" He said, "The kind with a notebook." She looked at the fire. He looked at her. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that has a shape, the kind that means something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. She said, "I know." He did not move. He did not reach for the rifle he wore. He just looked at her with those careful eyes and waited, because he was a man who waited, and she understood in that moment that she had always known this was coming, that some part of her had been building toward this moment since the first evening, and that the only question had ever been what she would do when it arrived. She told him everything. Not quickly, not with any particular drama. She told him the way you tell a true thing when you have been carrying it for too long and your arms are tired. Crane, the money, the description, the meetings with Ket at the trading post. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time, and she waited, and the fire burned down between them. Then he said, "The trees." She looked at him. He said, "I've seen them. Along the creek. Your knife work." She said yes. He said, "Were those for them or for you?" She said she had not decided yet. Then she said that was not quite true. She said she thought she had decided and had just been afraid to admit it. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the fire. Then he looked back at her, and she saw on his face the same expression she had seen that morning when she was reading, that quality of stillness, that recognition. And she understood that whatever was going to happen next was going to happen because of what was true and not because of what was convenient. And that was the only kind of thing that could happen between two people who were both in their own ways, constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway. He did not leave that night. January came in hard. The canyon country in deep winter was a different world from the autumn country. Stripped of color, the cottonwoods bare and silver, the creek running low under its ice, the sky a flat white that pressed down on the canyon walls like a lid. The cold was not the killing cold of the high mountains, but it was serious cold, the kind that required attention. And they spent the first weeks of the new year in a practical intimacy that had nothing romantic about it on the surface, and everything romantic about it underneath. Gathering wood, managing food stores, keeping the horses healthy, reading the weather off the rim. She had sent Ket a message in late December that said she had lost Dre's trail and was reconsidering her approach. Ket had sent back a message that said Crane was losing patience. She had read it, put it in the fire, and watched it burn with the particular feeling of a person who has made a decision and is watching the last exit close behind them. She was still carving the trees. She could not stop. Every day, somewhere along the route between her camp and the valley, which was now effectively their camp, though they had never formalized it, she found a tree and pressed his name into the bark. It had become the thing it was, which was what it had always been, a record, a path, something that said, "I was here, and this mattered, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." The path of carved trees now ran for nearly 2 miles. Anyone who knew what they were looking for could follow it from the confluence to the valley. She knew that. She had thought about it at length and had arrived at the conclusion that the risk was acceptable because the alternative, not making the record, not marking the path, was a kind of erasure she was no longer willing to perform. Dre knew about the trees. He had known since December. He had not asked her to stop, and he had not asked her to continue. He had simply accepted them the way he accepted most things, as facts of the landscape, as part of the truth of the place. In February, she found him standing at one of the trees. The third one, the cottonwood near the creek bend, the first one she had carved with her full name beside his, something she had started doing in January. S-A-Y and coal in the pale bark, side by side. He had his hand on the bark, not touching the letters, but near them, the way you hold your hand near fire to feel the heat without burning. She stood behind him for a moment. Then she walked up beside him, and they stood there together looking at the names, and neither of them said anything. And the creek made its sound under the ice, and a raven called once from somewhere up the canyon wall, and then was quiet. That was the earned silence. That was the moment that held everything. Crane's men came in March. Not Ket. Ket was a watcher, not a hunter. These were different men, 4 of them, riding heavy horses with a particular deliberate pace of men who have been told to bring someone back and have been paid enough to mean it. She heard them before she saw them. The horses' hooves on the canyon trail, the sound carrying in the cold air with the clarity that the canyon gave to everything. She was at the valley camp. Dre was upstream, checking the snares. She had maybe 10 minutes. She did not hesitate. She went to her horse, pulled her rifle, and started moving upstream at a run. She found him at the second snare, crouched in the brush, already still. He had heard them too. She came up beside him and said 4 men, armed, coming up the North Fork, and he looked at her once with those calculating eyes, and she saw him run through the options the way she had run through them herself on the way upstream, and arrive at the same place she had. He said, the West Rim. She said, I know a way up. He said, they'll follow the trees. She looked at him. He looked at her. This was the thing she had been carrying since January, the knowledge she had been turning over, that the path of carved names was also a path to him, that the thing she had made out of love was also the thing that could be used against him, that the record she had refused to erase was the record that could end him. She said, I'll go back and cut them. He said, there's no time. She said, then I'll misdirect them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Saya, just her name. The way he said it, flat and serious and full, was the most he had ever said to her with a single word. She said, go. I know what I'm doing. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She counted. Then he turned and moved upstream through the brush, fast and quiet, in the direction of the West Rim Trail, and she turned and went back down toward the valley camp. She reached the camp ahead of the 4 men by about 2 minutes, which was enough. She had her fire going and her book open on her knee when they rode in, and she looked up at them with the expression of a woman who was mildly surprised to have visitors, but not alarmed, which was the expression she had been practicing her whole life. The man in front was named Harker. She learned this later from the way one of the others addressed him. He had a marshal's badge that looked genuine and might have been. He asked if she had seen a man matching Dre's description. She said she had seen a man a few weeks back, passing through. Harker said, which direction? She pointed south, down the canyon, away from the West Rim, away from the trail she had spent 4 months walking. She pointed south with the steady hand of a woman who had been carrying a lie for a long time and knew exactly how to hold it. Harker looked at her camp. He looked at her horse. He looked at the book on her knee and then at her face, and she met his eyes with the particular quality of blankness that she had learned meant nothing to read here, and he read nothing. He said they would need to look around. She said, of course. They spent an hour in the valley camp, going through her things with the efficient disrespect of men who have been given authority and know how to use it. They found nothing that connected her to Dre. She had been careful about that from the beginning, careful in the way that people who have always lived on the edges of other people's authority learn to be careful. They found the Spanish poetry book, which one of them flipped through and put down. They found her knife, which Harker turned over in his hands and returned without comment. They found her supply stores, her bedroll, her horse tack. They did not go far enough up the creek to find the carved trees. Or rather, they found the first two. She watched Harker stop at the cottonwood near the creek bend and look at the carved names, and her heart did the thing it does when the thing you have been afraid of is actually happening, that cold, specific drop. But Harker looked at the names, Asawai and Cole, her knife work, pale against the dark bark, and she watched him decide it was nothing, a camp marking, a lover's notation of no operational significance, and he turned away. She breathed. They left in the early afternoon, heading south down the canyon, following the direction she had pointed them. She watched them go until they were around the bend, and the sound of the horses faded, and then she sat down on the ground next to the fire and put her hands flat on the cold earth and stayed there for a while. Dre came back 2 days later. He came down from the west rim in the early morning, moving carefully, and she heard him before she saw him and did not reach for her rifle. And he walked into the camp and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then he said, "They gone?" She said yes. He said, "South?" She said she had sent them south. He looked at her with that expression, the one she had been collecting all winter, the one she still did not have a name for. Then he sat down across the fire from her, in the same place he had sat on the first evening, and she handed him the last of the cornbread she had made that morning, and he took it, and they sat together while the canyon filled with light. She had carved his name on a tree every day for a year. She understood now what the carving was. It was not a trail marker for Crane's men. It was not a romantic gesture in any simple sense. It was something more specific and more durable than either of those things. It was the act of a woman who had spent her whole life making herself legible to other people's purposes, making herself useful, making herself fit the story that was needed, and who had finally, in the high canyon country with a knife and a fire and a man who waited instead of pushing, made a mark that was purely her own. The path of carved trees ran for nearly 2 miles along the North Fork and up the west tributary to the valley. If you followed it, it led you to the place where the light came in longest, where the creek was loudest, where two people had sat through a winter and read Spanish poetry and learned the particular texture of each other's silences. It led you to the place where she was real. Crane sent a second letter in April, delivered through Ket, who had the grace to look uncomfortable when he handed it to her. The letter said her contract was terminated. It said the search for Cole Dre had been reassigned. It said the original fee was hers to keep as a gesture of goodwill, which was the particular language Crane used when he wanted you to understand that he was letting you go and you should be grateful for it. She read the letter at the trading post, folded it in half, and put it in her coat pocket. Ket watched her do it. He said, carefully, that he hoped things were well up north. She said the country was fine. He said, the spring's good? She said, reliable. He nodded slowly. She thought she saw something in his face. Not sympathy exactly, but the acknowledgement of a person who has been in the business of watching long enough to know when a story has gone in a direction that cannot be argued with. He did not write anything in his notebook. He put the notebook away and offered her a tin of tobacco, and she took it, and they did not speak of Crane or Dre or the North Fork country again. She rode back up the canyon in the April warmth, the cottonwoods putting out their first pale green, the creek running full and cold with snowmelt from the high country. The hawk was back, or a hawk was back. She had never been certain it was the same one, riding the thermals above the rim in long, unhurried circles. She stopped at the cottonwood near the creek bend. The carved names were still there, weathered a little now, the pale wood darkening as it healed around the cuts. Say and Cole. The bark had grown slightly around the edges of the letters, the way bark does, incorporating the wound into the wood. She took out her knife. She pressed the blade to the bark beside the names, not over them, beside them. She carved a single word, the Apache word for the water that moves through you that is not your own. Then she put her knife away and rode up the canyon toward the valley, toward the fire she knew would be burning, toward the man who had heard her coming from half a mile away and was already, in his unhurried way, putting on more wood. The canyon country held them the way it holds everything, without sentiment, without ceremony, with the absolute and total indifference of a landscape that has been here longer than any human story and will be here long after. The walls of red sandstone did not care about crane or warrants or railroad surveys. The Creek did not care about contracts or money or the particular moral calculations of people trying to survive in a world that was always asking them to be less than they were. The land just was, and they were in it, and that, for a while, was enough. There's a version of this story where the carved names are a mistake, where Harker is more observant, where Ket is less decent, where Crane's second team comes up from the south before the first one leaves, where the trail through the cottonwoods leads exactly where a trail to a wanted man should lead, and the whole thing ends in iron and courtrooms and the particular grinding machinery of a justice system that has never been particularly interested in justice. That version exists. It lives alongside this one, a shadow story running parallel, always close enough to touch. But that is not what happened. What happened was a woman who had been paid to carry a lie chose, at the critical moment, to put it down. What happened was a man who had been running for 2 years stopped running, not because he was caught, but because he had been seen, actually seen, by someone who looked at what he was and did not flinch and did not look away. What happened was a path of carved names along a canyon creek that could have been a trap and was instead a record of something true. What happened was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the most important things always are, not dramatic in the moment, not announced, not witnessed by anyone who would have recognized its significance. Just two people in a canyon, in the cold, making a choice to be real. The trees still stand in the story and in the country that the story is made of. The bark has grown around the letters now, years of slow wood closing over the cuts, but if you know where to look, if you know the North Fork Trail and the particular cottonwood at the creek bend and the way the light falls in the late afternoon, you can still read them. The names. The word beside them, the record of a year. She carved his name every day because she needed to know that the year was real, that she had been there, that she had chosen something true over something convenient, even when the convenient thing was also the necessary thing, even when the cost of the true thing was not entirely clear. She carved his name because some things need to be written down, because the land holds what you give it, because a knife in bark is more honest than a word in a letter, more permanent than a promise, more true than any story that someone else has paid you to tell. She carved his name because she loved him and because she was not the kind of woman who could love something and pretend she didn't, and because the canyon country had given her back to herself after years of being useful to other people's purposes, and that was a debt you paid not with money, but with honesty. She carved his name because it was hers to carve. That is the whole story. That is all of it. The canyon holds it. The trees hold it. The creek running cold under the ice holds it, and the hawk on the thermal holds it, and the light coming in longest over the valley in the late afternoon holds it, and the fire burning in the small camp at the center of things holds it, and the two people sitting beside it, not performing anything, not carrying anything that does not belong to them, just present in the place where they are real, they hold it too. They hold it the way the land holds everything, without sentiment, without ceremony, with the absolute and total permanence of a thing that is simply, completely, undeniably true. If you have been with this story from the beginning, if you have stayed through the cold and the canyon and the silence and the carved names, then you already know what it was about. You knew before the end. You could feel it in the way the fire burned down and the two people sat beside it and chose, over and over, to stay. That is the only story worth telling, the one where someone chooses to stay. If this story stayed with you, if it found something in you that recognized the canyon country or the carved names or the particular weight of choosing the true thing over the convenient one, then leave it a like. Share it with someone who needs a story like this one. And if you want more stories from the edges of history, more people who carried knives and lies and made something true out of both, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from. There always are.